Okay, today we're going to have a very basic introduction to carbohydrates, proteins and lipids. So, so there are three biological molecules in the human body. These are carbohydrates, lipids and proteins. Now, carbohydrates and lipids are made up entirely of the elements carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Whereas proteins, they are also made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. But they also contain nitrogen and some sulfur in small amounts, but not always. So let's look at these individually because their structures are very different and the structures determine their properties and how they're used. So first let's look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. So carbohydrates come and can be very simple sugars, or they can be really big molecules like starch. So these are like a polymer type molecule, and this would be like a monomer. So let's explain that. So let's say we have a very simple sugar. Fructose. And that's just sugar that's found in fruits. You can also have, we'd call a simple sugar like fructose, we'd call it a monosaccharin. Saccharide, sorry. And let's just draw, like, these are going to represent our little fructose molecules. We can also have glucose, which is another simple sugar, and the chemical symbol element, the glucose is made up of 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen and 6 oxygen. So we can see how, so we've got carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Now this shows us something quite interesting. The word carbohydrate, so the carbo bit here is the carbon, and the hydrate bit here is the hydrogen and oxygen, which sounds a bit like hydroxyl, can't get the spell right. Oxygen. The hydrate is like hydrogen and oxygen, which sounds a bit like water. And in fact, if you look, the ratio of carbon to hydrogen is 2 to 1, and that's the same as in water, H2O, water. So in our carbohydrates, you've got this relationship of the 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 carbon, which is just a wee interesting little aside. So we can get, and I'm just for our glucose molecule, we're going to draw that like funny. There we go. So these are like monosaccharides. They're like one group. If you've done much chemistry, we'd think of them as monomers. We can take 2 of these. So let's take one of our glucose molecules, a little hexagon with a little pentagon, and we can join them together. And here we've made sucrose, which is sugar. It's what we covers our table sugar. And we would call that disaccharide, because it's 2. The di means 2, whereas the mono means 1. Now what we can also have is when we have, let's take our glucose molecules, and we're getting a big chain of them bonded together. That's a terrible one. Try and make this a bit better. There we go. Now we've got this chain. It's a polymer chain of glucose. And what we've now made here is starch. So starch is only found in plant tissues, but it's something that's really it's an important molecule. It's found in rice, bread, all your kind of wheat products has got starch in it, potatoes. So our bodies use starch, and when it breaks it down, it's going to break it down into glucose. Now in human bodies, we have a carbohydrate called glycogen. This is also, we call these polymer chains are called, so polymer chain, put it here, polymer chain of the monosaccharides is called polysaccharide. Polysaccharide. So glycogen is a polysaccharide which is used to store energy in our liver and in muscle. So you'd find glycogen, which is very similar idea to starch, but it's inside our liver and muscle, and it stores energy. So this is our carbohydrates. Let's think about lipids. You may know that lipids are essentially, and a very basic idea of them is they're fats and oils. Fats tend to be in animal tissue, and oils in plants. So you get your olive oils, whereas fats is, if you get a bit of meat, you'll see the fat. lipids also contain our carbon, our hydrogen, and oxygen. But the oxygen tends to be in smaller amounts than carbohydrates. So, for example, e.g., tristan is a fat that we find in meat, has a chemical formula C51H98O, oxygen 6. Now, chemical building blocks of lipids are two molecules. So you can think of a lipid as a glycerol molecule, and then you get 3 fatty acids. So these are fatty acids. We can also glycerol is also known as glycerine, and that glycerine is something you can buy. You can do baking with it. It's a molecule in its own right that is often used in cosmetics. It's a kind of an oily substance, and then so this glycerol molecule is bonded to these 3 fatty acids. And the different types of fatty acids will determine the type of lipid that we're dealing with. But this here is the basic structure of all lipids. And then that brings us on to proteins. Again, they contain our carbon, our hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in this instance, and sometimes sulfur. So the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is the same as what we had in the carbohydrates and the lipids, but now we've got with this proteins, nitrogen, and sometimes the sulfur. So starch was a polymer of a single building block of glucose. We had that big long chain of glucose molecules that make starch. But a protein is also a polymer. But it's a polymer of amino acids. And all proteins are built from 20 amino acids. So if we think of them linked, this time my little shapes are amino acids. And there's 20 different kinds. In reality, there's over 500 types of amino acids, but only 20 of them are used in the building of proteins. And proteins are really important for enzymes. Are proteins. They're structural. So hair, nails, these are all proteins. And hemoglobin is another. Hemoglobin is another example of proteins, and so are hormones. Proteins also perform important functions inside our cells. So proteins are really important structures within the human body, and this, because we've got 20 different amino acids that come up and build this polymer, and they fold and they change their shape in different ways, that gives it a huge variety of different structures, and therefore you have this huge variety of proteins that are possible to be formed. So that's a very basic introduction to the world of carbohydrates, lipids and proteins.